Boom. Great. The opioid crisis. You can hear me? Since the year 2000, opioid addiction and overdose have risen at alarming rates in the US and Canada. The CDC reports that the opioid-related deaths have quadrupled from 1999 to 2016. In 2014, 47,000 died of overdoses in the US. About half involved prescription medications, the other half were illegal drugs like heroin. The root cause of the crisis came from a cultural shift in the medical community that began to prescribe more opioids in the 1990s. The impression for the first time was that properly prescribed, they would not lead to addiction. This proved to be false, and many became addicted through this vector. The profit motives drive new opioid development and more prescriptions. Patient rights groups also contributed by promoting the need for serious pain management. Those who became addicted to legal prescription medications often turned to illegal prescription drugs or illicit opioids such as heroin when their prescriptions expire, sending them into a downward spiral. My interpretation for this debate: I interpreted the resolution as calling for increased efforts by law enforcement and the courts to prosecute and existing laws, drug laws pertaining to opioid drugs. I stand resolved that more aggressive enforcement of existing laws will not solve the crisis. A solution must include a dramatic reduction in new and existing opioid addicts. Solvency would look like conditions before the crisis began. The con's burden. The con must show that prosecution is the primary means to solve the problem, not a little brother to other more significant methods. Any other successful strategies support Pro's position that prosecution is not the primary means to solve the crisis. Contention 1, prosecution methods fail. A rational analysis for failure. Because prescription medications started and fueled the epidemic are illegal, prosecution will have minimal impact on the creation of new addicts. Prosecution does not cure anyone of heroin addiction or other opioid addictions. It thus cannot decrease the number of addicts. Prosecution creates a dangerous black market, which leads to uncontrolled doses, leading to fatal overdoses. B, prosecution strategies have led to a worsening crisis. This is from the Cato Institute in 2017. Under drug prohibition, poor information quality and flow combined with potency effects on both sides of the market would predict an increase in drug-related deaths. This is precisely what we observe. In 1971, 2 years before the creation of the DEA, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported that slightly more than 1 death per 100,000 people in the United States was related to drug overdose. This figure rose to 3.4 deaths per 100,000 in 1990. By 2008, there were 12 overdose deaths per 100,000 people. These numbers have continued to climb. According to the CDC, more than 47,000 overdose deaths occurred in the United States in 2014, representing 14.7 deaths for every 100,000 people in the United States, the most overdose deaths ever recorded in this country. Between 2000 and 2014, more people in the United States died from drug overdoses than from car crashes. We've seen the war on drugs since 1971. In that time, we've only seen drug use increase and deaths from overdose skyrocket. This is the outcome of prosecution strategy. It is not a solution.
All right, hi, Siegfried, can you hear me? Okay, excellent. So I will be proposing 3 particular types of prosecution which I think should increase. The first is prosecution of big business who has been peddling and massively advertising these drugs and misrepresenting their effectiveness, their therapeutic use, and their addictiveness, despite the fact that they well know what those things are and do not do so in other countries. For example, in a landmark case, Purdue, who was one of the businesses initially responsible for pushing these advertisements, was fined $600 million for misleading the public. I would suggest that that case needs to be revisited because the amount which they were making out of that misleading was more than $600 million. I would increase the prosecution to effectively try and steal every penny back which they made off this money, because it is effectively ill-gotten gains and made out of an illegal practice of false advertising and misleading the public. Secondly, doctors.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I clicked by accident. Secondly, doctors. Doctors know what the therapeutic prescription of high-dose opiates such as oxycodone and fentanyl, and they're prescribing them anyway, well knowing that it is outside the guidelines. The amount of the USA and Canada take up 80% of the world's legal opioid prescription, despite being 5% of the prescribed population. That's crazy. What that means is that Canadians and US citizens are being diagnosed with pain which they do not have and prescribed drugs which they do not need. There are many, many, many alternatives to pain relief which these doctors know of. They know that they will be satisfactory, and they do not do them anyway. The reason they are not doing this is because they are taking high incentives and effectively bribes from these big pharmaceutical companies. What I would suggest is that they are in violation of their Hippocratic oath. They are in violation of their professional obligations to put the patient's interest before their own. And the culture of not prosecuting high status individuals like doctors has allowed these people to effectively be drug peddlers and get away with what in any other context, if they had any other job title, would have put them in jail. Lastly, consumers. I believe that consumers need to, when they buy drugs and when they decide to take these pills from doctors, know that there is a very high chance that they will end up in jail as a result of their purchasing. This is before they're addicted. This is before they've been refused a prescription and going into the black market. I think that they need to know that taking a drug like oxycodone or fentanyl has at least like a 40% chance of landing them in prison and will make them seriously think twice about taking them. In countries like Australia, the only people who take these drugs are the extremely elderly, people who are actually in the sorts of chronic pain who have already tried all of the other methods. I think that culture could introduce itself to the US and Canada if patients knew that the risks they are taking upon themselves when accepting these prescriptions could land them in jail. I'll finish off in later by substantiating why these people do need to stay in jail because of the effects them have been in the public on their families and their children are. But for now, I'll pass it back to you.
To rebels, let me present the following. These are the reasons why prosecution methods generally fail. It doesn't address the demand for drugs because it doesn't cure addicts. It drives addicts into the shadows, which makes treatment harder. It leads to broken homes and families when people are sent to jail, usually addicts and small-time drug dealers. This leads to more poverty and drug abuse. It eliminates smaller suppliers, leaving large violent cartels in charge of the supply. And in your case, eliminates legal suppliers, leaving these people in charge and creating violent situations. It drives up the potency in order to make the products easier to smuggle because it's illegal. And the black market drugs are unregulated, leading to increased overdoses and impunity for excessive potency. In summary, we tried this before with a prohibition on alcohol, and that was a failure. We've tried the war on drugs since 1971, and that's been a failure. It's time for newer, better strategies. Contention number 2, treatment methods do succeed. In 2017, journalist Kenneth Anderson undertook an exhaustive study of opioid use. He looked at data from 33 countries which have published detailed data about drug dependence, overdose, treatment responses over long periods of time. 7 countries were successful at greatly reducing opioid deaths: Australia, Germany, Greece, Italy, Luxembourg, Norway, and Switzerland. Why were these countries successful when the US had failed so miserably? The only commonality was that all 7 countries had extremely good access to opioid substitution therapy, or OST. Importantly, opioid substitution therapy is essentially free for patients in 6 out of the 7 countries, Australia being the only exception. OST is available for everyone who needs it, and there are generally no wait times, so patients are in no danger of overdosing while they wait for their treatment. Also, patients are not kicked out of treatment if their urine tests prove positive for other drugs, such as done in the US. Treatment is the priority, not punishment. The evidence suggests that cheap and free easy access to OST is the most fundamental building block of success needed for the opioid crisis. In summary, while prohibition has failed the US time and time again, prevention has solved the opioid crisis in nations which have embraced treatment as their primary strategy. Let's talk a little bit about Khan's contentions here. He wants to ban big business. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily illegal at this time. Only a small percentage of businesses are practicing illegally. Most of them are prescribing and supplying these opioids quite legally, and the resolution calls for persecution of the existing laws, not making new ones, which would be a new strategy. It does not actually stop the supply. It only hinders the supply to some degree, and it forces more people out into the illegal market, which we've seen as bad. Doctors take a Hippocratic oath to protect their patients. I think they generally respect that. There's intense patient pressure on doctors, so simply kowtowing them won't work. They listen to their patients, not to others. It's not necessarily illegal for them to make these prescriptions, and there's no enforcement mechanism by which you can tell who legitimately needs these medications and who doesn't. So this makes it an unworkable solution. And consumers, you're trying to punish them before addiction to frighten them somehow. When people are in great pain, they take medication that they need.
Okay, first thing, I'm going to address the attacks on my contentions. The first one is he said that I'm not increasing prosecution of business because those will be new laws. I will point you to the example which I talked about where a company, and I'll spell it out, it's P-U-R-D, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's like P-U-R-D-U-E, has already been fined $600 million for misleading the public. that would infer that this is not a new law. This is an existing law, which they have already paid the price for. What I'm saying is that that price was inadequate. We need to increase, if you will, the prosecution of those laws, and we need to make an example out of some of these businesses to disincentivize them from doing this into the future. Secondly, doctors. He says that that what they're doing is legal. What part of being a doctor is that you have to get a license to practice medicine, and that license is obtained from the state. The state puts conditions on those licenses, such as acting in the best interest of your patient and not putting your own financial interest above patient health. What I would suggest is that we need to be making examples out of these doctors and actually take these licenses away and then prosecute them for medical malpractice, which is what they are guilty of when they give 20-year-olds a highly addictive substances they full well know in the midst of an opiate crisis could put them on the streets when they could just be prescribing them Panadol. That is medical malpractice and needs to be prosecuted. Doctors should not be immune to prosecution just because their jobs are high status. Let's look at his contentions. The first one is he says it does not access demand. It absolutely does. If increased prosecution, as I suggest, reduces the incentive for them to advertise, reduces the amount they are prescribed, then that absolutely reduces demand because less people get put on the drugs to begin with. The thing which makes the opioid crisis unique from other drug problems is that the habit starts out legal. We need to make sure that doctors and businesses and patients know that the initial acceptance of that illegal prescription and the initial offering of that legal prescription is something which actually is illegal if the law was enforced as it should be, and they will pay the price for it. So by reducing the amount of people who start out to begin with, it absolutely reduces demand. I agree that in the short term, this will break up families. The opioids are doing this anyway. These people's lives are ruined. So the margins which are going to ruin them slightly more by protecting them from their habit and keeping them in jail, where at least they can't overdose and die from fentanyl, I actually propose this in some cases a benefit. The last thing he said is that we've tried before, how come Australia, other nations? Australia and other nations never had an opioid crisis to begin with on the scale which the US does. The reason, for example, Australia and many Asian nations in particular don't have that isn't because they didn't enforce the prosecution once they had the crisis. It's that the doctors in those countries would have never prescribed it at those rates to begin with. That the companies wouldn't have dared advertise in those ways to begin with because we actually enforce our laws properly. So he's misattributing the cause as to why we don't have it in other countries.
From the top. The point of the evidence was to examine countries which have reduced opioid use and have decreased the number of deaths from opioid use. Those countries have successfully done that. The countries that focus on prosecution have not. The United States has focused on prosecution since 1971. It's tried to get tough over and over and over again. That has failed consistently, leading to the crisis that we have. Those countries understood that in order to get rid of the crisis, you need to get people off of the drugs. And the prevention methods in the OST do that very effectively. And that's why Australia has had great success in reducing and not having a crisis in the first place. You admit that opioids break families. You suggest that maybe putting people in jail would be better. Unfortunately, that's not the case. What happens when people go into jail, they don't stop being addicts. They don't get any treatment there. And when they come out, their tolerances are actually reduced. They usually go out and they get hit up and they die at higher rates because they're more susceptible to addiction and overdose once they get out of jail. So it actually leads to more deaths. As we have seen, because we've tried this much in the U.S. In the U.S. right now, there are more than 206,000 people in state prisons and 46,000 people in federal prisons. We've gotten tough on drug users, and it hasn't worked. You say that you're going to access demand, but all you've really decided to do is punish bad actors. You decided to punish doctors who you think are doing bad things, even though you're going to have a hard time proving which ones are bad and which ones are good. And it's not going to reduce the supply because there will be more doctors, and the demand is key. So long as people want these pain medications for legitimate pain management, doctors will prescribe them. There'll be a financial incentive to do so. People will simply figure out a better and more legal method in order to provide these drugs. Finding, yes, since you're not creating any new laws, we will only be able to prosecute so much as we already have. Stronger fines won't necessarily reduce people from supplying opioids. It will just make them more careful in order to avoid those penalties. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Prosecution is a failed strategy, while treatment is a successful one. From the RAND Policy Research Center back in 1994, the RAND Drug Policy Research Center study concluded that $3 billion should be switched from federal local law enforcement and to treatment. The report also said that treatment is the cheapest way to cut drug use, stating that drug treatment is 23 times more effective dollar per dollar than the supply side war on drugs with these prosecution methods. The Business Insider 2016 points out that in July 2001, Portugal, suffering from a similar drug crisis, decriminalized all drugs, including marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. Drug-related HIV infections have plummeted over 90%. Drug-related deaths in Portugal are now the second lowest in the European Union. The number of adults who have done drugs in the past year has decreased steadily since 2001, and the number of people in drug treatment increased 60% from 1998 to 2011, going from 23,600 to 38,000. Treatment works, prosecution does not.
Okay, bottom to top. The first thing I would point out is that his comparisons to existing strategies are totally irrelevant because no country has ever attempted prosecution on the scale of which I am suggesting in this debate. They have all shielded doctors because of their social status. They have all shielded business because of crony capitalist interests. What I am suggesting is like nothing which has ever been done before. So using existing, the existing increased prosecution only of offenders, which is basically politicians doing tokenistic efforts to make it look like they're solving the drug crisis, will of course fail, right? But actually, what I'm suggesting is a more full, a more in the spirit of the motion debate, which is going after everyone who is involved in this mess, and thus his studies are totally irrelevant. So the next thing before that he said was fines. He said, well, the business will just be more careful to avoid the fines. What I would suggest is that being more careful is the reason why is my policy working. When a business is more careful in their advertising strategies to avoid fines, that means that those ads don't push people towards those medicines as much. That means that there is more things like labels on the boxes saying for 3-day use only. That is the sort of thing which means that patients can look at the box and look at the prescription and say, why is it that my box is going against what the doctor is saying? And able to report, for example, when their doctor is prescribing outside of therapeutic guidelines. That is the case in Australia, for example, where no doctor would ever dream of prescribing opioids in the way in which they're being prescribed in the US, because the pharmacist involved would simply look at the prescription and say, this is way outside therapeutic guidelines, and report that doctor. I've worked in a pharmacy and seen this happen. These drugs which are being prescribed are used regularly for post-op patients when the 3 levels of pain preventative levels down have already failed. They are jumping to the highest possible prescription for the lowest possible problem, and that is medical malpractice and deserves prosecution. The next thing he says is it's going to be hard to tell which doctors are doing this. No, it's incredibly easy actually, because for example, the 30-day free supply packs which these companies were giving out and which doctors were handing to their suppliers is already 27 days larger than therapeutic use suggests. It's incredibly easy to spot where these doctors are. They're everywhere. They need to go to prison, or at the very least, they need to lose their licenses. Or the other thing as well, we don't need to, for example, prosecute every controversial case. We just need to make enough examples out of doctors that they are disincentivized from continuing this practice in the future out of fear. The last thing he was talking about was the people. As to, look, we need to help them get off the drugs. It is very, very difficult to get them off these drugs. That is the wrong way to solve this problem. You will never find a method which is able to compete with the addictiveness of fentanyl, which is why many people on those methadone treatments often go off them or have to go on and off them between their habit. The correct way to do it is to stop people from getting drugs in the first place, which is why you need to make people scared that taking these drugs will send them to jail and make doctors scared to prescribe them.
Con would have you believe that it's impossible to cure yourself of these kinds of addictions. And while it may be difficult, it's definitely possible. We've seen success in multiple countries. Those countries that have pursued therapies in order to get people off of these drugs have found success in reducing their opioid crisis. Those countries that have not adopted this strategy and have adopted a strategy of get tough on drugs and prosecution have failed and are suffering from increasing opioid crises. That is the truth of the real world as we have seen it. His contentions that, oh, it's really hard, are just his assurances, but I have solid evidence that shows that these programs are effective. I have solid evidence and expert opinion that shows that prosecution methods fail. Now, he says, well, these are going to be special prosecution methods. We're going to somehow magically be able to, we're going to equip the cops with fairy wands. I don't know. We're going to find all the bad guys, and we're definitely going to shut them down. It's not that easy. Prosecution is not a magic power. This is not the world of RoboCop or science fiction. These methods have been tried. They've been tried for year after year after year, and they failed year after year after year, leading to ever-increasing numbers of deaths, ever-increasing numbers of people addicted. It's a terrible idea. Doing more of a terrible idea is not a good idea. So he says that they're going to go after doctors, but you'll notice that he hasn't identified exactly which of these practices are illegal and how many doctors are actually participating in the illegal practices. He just has a general idea that, well, there's some bad practices going on. If we go after these people, there's going to be some kind of a problem. But what he can't show you is that actually going to have any impact on the opioid crisis. He has to do that today in order to win this debate. He has to show that not only will prosecution have a measured effect, not only can we likely expect it to work, but it will be the most effective strategy that we can pursue. And he hasn't done that. He's just sort of talked about the ways in which he would like to punish doctors. The truth is, most of these opioids were prescribed legally for people with serious chronic pain, that they went into the doctor. There was an understanding that these things would not cause addictions at the time, so they were prescribed, and they're given proper recommendations in order to follow, generally speaking. But once a person gets home, they're welcome to take as many pills as they want. There is nobody there minding them. And sometimes they get extra pain, they take extra pills, they start to become addicted, and you get this cycle. So the legal prescription was one of the big drivers of this method. Not a legal prescription, not malpractice. He hasn't shown that this is derived significantly from policies that are illegal or actions that are illegal. He's only shown that there is some of that out there, when generally speaking, the consensus view is that legal prescriptions are what drove the initiation of this crisis, and trying to punish people is not. Furthermore, as I've shown, black markets create greater levels of death from overdoses. And if he is successful in driving out doctors from prescribing these medications, there will simply be a black market for pain medications, and it will lead to much more dangerous results for those people who are trying to seek relief from chronic pain and for those who are addicted to these substances.
Just quickly, I'm just going to do a few back and forths. On that last point you brought out, so you would actually be okay with doctors prescribing people the medication just to fuel their addiction, even if it has no therapeutic use, just to keep them out of the black market?
It would be better for the patients, yes, if they received drugs that they knew the exact doses of and which were not going to kill them. That would be superior to the alternative.
That's currently illegal. The reason that doctors cannot prescribe medicines for no therapeutic use just to fuel addiction. So you like that. I don't think that's in the debate. The black markets ultimately rely on demand. If no one gets addicted in the first place, then obviously the black market isn't a problem. The next question I want to ask you is, with the prosecution has been tried, can you give me the number of how many doctors have been prosecuted for medical malpractice recently in all these countries, which apparently has been tried and failed?
I do not know the answer to that question. I would also add, though, however, there are millions of people already addicted to these drugs.
Okay, I agree that in the short term, the millions of people already addicted will suffer. I am going for the long term, which is the generations and generations, which will easily outscale that number in the first place. The reason you're unable to tell me is because they haven't been. As I've said from the start, and which you haven't rebutted, right, until your last speech, doctors have got a social immunity from this kind of thing because they don't like, the law rarely goes after high status individuals. What I would suggest is that you don't even need to successfully put them in jail or remove any licenses to create the sufficient disincentive. For example, all you need to do is put a large section of doctors on trial and make them justify to the families of the people who their prescribing patients have killed, right? And put that on the public record, have their reputation dragged through the dirt, make them invest money in lawyers to defend themselves. And even if they get off, I don't think a single doctor would ever prescribe with that sort of recklessness again, because they do not want to risk going through the procedure. And the reason this solves the opioid crisis, which I've explained, but you suggest I haven't, is that when doctors no longer prescribe them in the first place, no one goes to a black market because no one gets addicted in the first place, right? No one ever gets on the opioids. There's no reason why this Australia, and other nations comparison is just bogus, right? The Australian methadone scheme has roughly 44,000 people in it. That is less than the amount of people who died from overdoses alone in the United States just this year, right? Like, the scale is just completely different. The reason these methadone treatments work in these other countries is that they don't have opioid crises. They have, yes, these sort of regular people who are taking drugs illegally, but they don't have the same hundreds and thousands of people who have been put on these drugs legally, dubiously, to begin with. What I would suggest is that the only method by which you could justify the current rate of prescribing being legal is if you would throw out every therapeutic guideline, every obligation doctors have under their medical licenses, and just shield them from prosecution because of social immunity. What they are doing is illegal, or at the very least, there is a case to be made that it's illegal. You can indict a ham sandwich. You can certainly indict one of these doctors, and in which case the process alone will disincentivize them from continuing to prescribe in this awful way.
You can argue about Australia's scale, but the truth is that we're looking for techniques which get results. Those techniques get results. It's simply a matter of scaling them up over time. There's no reason why a critical mass of opioid addicted people makes treatment not work anymore. If treatment works, if it's successful in these countries, then we would expect it to work in other places. The scale of the United States, in order to try and crack down, would be just as ineffective as anything else. Scale is always a bit of a challenge, but you can easily overcome it. Putting doctors on trial, a big show trial of the century, et cetera, that's already been done. There's already thousands of articles about opioid prescriptions. People don't pay attention because, generally speaking, most doctors are ethical people already who follow the rules. They're not criminals. They already swore an oath to protect their patients. They're generally looking out for their patient's best interest. Opioid medications are actually very good for pain management, which is why they have been used, but they have the problem of addiction, and it's gotten that way. Without any legal activity already to change these directions. It's ridiculous to say that for those who are greedy, that a show trial will make a difference. Money always talks and will bring unscrupulous people to the table. However, those who are not unscrupulous will on their own make good practices, generally speaking. And you're not showing any kind of solvency, which is the most critical thing in this debate. You have to show that you will definitely solve the crisis. You're only giving us a wild guess. I've shown actual evidence on what does solve these crises in other countries. I've shown actual evidence that prosecution methods fail, lead to more deaths and more problems. It's a failed strategy that we've been trying all this time. It has not worked whatsoever. We need to have a difference. You already said yourself there that you're giving up on the current generation. You're going to make something long-term to argue for future generations. That's a noble thought, but the resolution requires a solution to the opioid crisis, not some long-term future definition. In the meantime, people are suffering. We need action now. We need to take effective measures. Effective measures would be prevention, not prosecution. I've shown this a number of times.
First thing, giving up on the current generation, if it actually solves the opioid crisis for the next generation, is solving the opioid crisis. So that is not rebuttal, it's a non sequitur. Second thing, you were saying all your examples of how it has worked in other countries are totally irrelevant because, as I've pointed out, the other countries never had an opioid crisis on the scale of the US and Canada to begin with. What they are doing is simply treading water of treating their existing illegal drug users. That is not going to solve the opioid crisis. And the reason for that is that despite all the times you said it's really successful, it's obviously not. People relapse all of the time. And when they relapse, they often bring their kids down with them, their families down with them. Many of them die from overdoses. If it was as easy as putting them in rehab, then we would have done that already. The reason we haven't is because, unfortunately, the sad truth of it is, and I've looked at these documentaries and these stories are just terrible. But even with the best rehab programs we have, barely anyone gets through them. Most people relapse at least once, and during that time, many of them die. So what your policy will always do, unfortunately, is it will never, ever cure as many people of this addiction as newly addicted people have been introduced, which means it will exist into perpetuity. But then you're saying I haven't shown solvency. As I've pointed out, if doctors become so afraid to prescribe these prescriptions in America the way they're doing right now, that they start to do it in the way which they do it in Asia and Canada and in Europe, then you will never have an opioid crisis to begin with because nobody will be addicted to the drugs. Your own characterization at the start of the debate showed that and I agree with, that most people get into this addiction and starting with prescriptions, right? So if you stem the flow of those prescriptions, you solve the crisis because no one is addicted in the first place. That's your solvency. You then in your last speech said, we've tried the doctor trials before. We absolutely have not, and you have not given any examples of where that has happened. It's not about if people pay attention, which you suggest is the reason it won't work. It's if the other doctors in the medical community pay attention. And as for your thing that, well, look, there's still going to be a lot of money in for them, so they're going to malpractice anyway. What I would suggest is that calls for increased prosecution and reclaiming of every cent they made and more, right? We should absolutely bankrupt doctors whose prescriptions end up killing people. They should never be allowed to work as a doctor again. That is what increased prosecution looks like, and is something which has never been tried before and should be tried now.
Prosecution has been tried many times and it fails. Trying to turn up the screws does not work. You've shown no solvency whatsoever. You've given us no reason to expect that your plan will actually stem prescriptions of opioid use. And if they did stem the prescriptions of opioid use, you would end up with prescriptions or opioids on the black market, which would kill more people. This does not solve the crisis. It makes the crisis work. All my evidence shows that there is a better way, which is to treat people and get them off the drugs. You've got no hard evidence that that doesn't work. I've got hard evidence that it does.
Okay, first thing, for any of his black market or for any of the breaking up families harms to actualize, the people need to be addicted in the first place. That is the solvency I brought you in this round. If companies no longer advertise, if doctors are afraid to prescribe, and if people know that sending these drugs will send them to prison, they won't ever take them in the first place. Problem solved. I will post the links at the bottom as to how these rehab things don't work as well as he makes them out to be, and that is the base.